I'm Natalia Lobach, and this is Change Course. Questions and answers. Here on the Change Course podcast, we sometimes take a pause from our regularly scheduled programming and answer a question from one of our listeners or one of the communities that we participate in. I saw such a good question this morning that I had to come and address it. So after I sent over a few tips and tricks for the person who's part of this community that we're in with a bunch of international change experts, I thought, you know what, this is a great question to address on the podcast because the question itself can be translated to so many different environments. So the question today is, help! I'm trying to implement change in an organization that has a very cynical culture and is also unionized. What kind of tools and tricks can I use? So I found this question very interesting, and many of the existing change methodologies out there just do not address this type of environment. The assumption is that, if you hit them with the whiff 'em, as I've said before, the what's in it for me, that I've referred to in a couple previous episodes, if you hit them with the whiff 'em, everything is going to be okay. People will come around, they'll see the light, they'll understand. But sometimes in specific types of cultures and specific types of systems, this approach doesn't work for the majority of the people that you're trying to work with or influence. So union cultures are very specific and very interesting. It's important to note the history of the union movement in North America and where it came from and why. And unions were organized by workers to ensure that the workers, that is, had good working conditions, fair working conditions, and were being paid a fair wage. And this came from traditions of and history of exploitative labor practices in the Industrial Revolution. And so unions played a vital role in developing and ensuring the rights and health and safety of workers. And so unions have played a vital role in society and in this place. And many of the benefits that we enjoy today as employees of organizations, we can thank the labor movement for many of those things. Things like workers' compensation benefits, things like insurance and health and dental benefits, pharmaceutical, mental health, working hours, right to disconnect legislation. All of these things stem from this essential movement. At the same time, there can be, in this system of protection, of unions, of labor organization, it is a system in unto itself. And it is a system which is built to maintain a certain standard. And the system itself also, in many ways, resists change. So, for example, in a unionized organization or an organization that has unionized workers, the union will negotiate on behalf of the workers with the organization for things like compensation and benefits, et cetera, et cetera. And so the organization does not work with employees individually. They work with the union and then will have specific bands or specific categories or specific groups of employees within the organization that receive fair wages, that have, increases to wages based on certain things at certain times, as well as things like seniority and experience being valued, and many other things. So because of the relationship between the organization and the union, which represents the employees, there are sometimes difficulties in speaking with and accessing employees directly in unionized environments. When you're working with change, it's really helpful to be able to access those who you are working with directly. And so this is where you see disconnect within these organizations. So disconnect between leadership and the people that they manage, and a disconnect in terms of communication and the ability to involve and engage the employees that you're working with. And this has to do with, again, being, making sure that there are fair labor practices. So not asking employees to do additional work without compensation, things like stakeholder meetings and things like, involvement in initiatives is compensated. And so these types of things have to be worked out within, the full amount of hours that employee is working under their unionized agreement. So it becomes a little bit complicated to coordinate these things. It's very different in an organization that is a profession-based organization where you don't have these types of rules and these types of barriers. So in a unionized environment where you're looking at change, this is why connected change is so powerful, because you must first of all consider those with power and those with influence in the organization. There are two groups within a unionized environment that have power and influence. Number one, your union leaders. And those are the individuals who have been selected by the workers to represent them to the organization. So your leaders. So there could be, a variety of leaders in the union that are associated with your site or organization. So find out who they are. The second is your long service employees. So those who have seniority in a union environment often have increased influence. First of all, they've been around the longest. Second of all, they know the system really well. Third of all, they tend to have a higher amount of referential or influence type of power within their peer group, the peer group being the employees. So these are the individuals that you're going to be looking for: power, influence, and then of course, those influential folks are likely to be good candidates for change champions. Here's where it's really important to look at the history of the union in the organization and the history of the relationship between the union and the organization. That context is going to be extremely important as you build your approach to the change. Second is going to be the stories. So the stories around the relationship with the organization, how the union and the employees interact with the organization, what kind of labor activity has been happening. Have there been strikes? Have there been work to rule? Is this a negative type of combative environment where employees don't feel like their needs are being served? Or is this a different type of environment and relationship? And what characterizes that relationship? That will help you understand how you're going to be able to work through the change. Another piece that was mentioned in the question was a degree of culture and this cynicism that was being described. So, when you're looking at a culture of cynicism, this is where, if there's already a very strong negative tone to the culture of the organization and potentially that relationship with the union and the organization, you're going to need to address the change within the context of this culture. Cynicism is a really hard one to work with. Negative culture is very hard to work with. Cynicism can be a double-edged sword. You can see the challenges, of course, of a highly negative culture, but then you can also have cynicism work with things like testing solutions before they're implemented, identifying potential problems, identifying risk and ways to mitigate it. These are all some of the things where you can start to see that benefit of a cynical, or if we want to, rebrand it, highly analytical, maybe hypercritical, in terms of critical thinking, that type of environment. Those are the positives. So if there are any ways that a person or a change leader can harness those positives, that will help immensely. So the other thing I want to mention about this type of environment is this is where negative incentives to change can be helpful. Because you have a negative culture, a culture of cynicism, trying to appeal to the bright and shiny future, optimism, those types of positive emotions are not going to work. They're going to go against the culture and they're going to seem insincere and hollow. It's not going to work and it's not going to resonate with the individuals that you're working with. One of the things, though, that we can tap into here is what are the negative consequences of not changing? Because the system is set up to maintain the status quo, in a unionized environment, this is especially strong. Unions, by their nature, resist change because change can, in many ways, threaten their position, also threaten the potential well-being of the employees. But the union itself is a system, and we have to remember that there are points at which that system is going to aggregate power and control. And so, in that environment, the system does not want to change. It will resist change. So not only do you have the individuals resisting change, but you have this very strong system resisting change as well. So working with the system is going to be imperative. And one of the ways you can do that is highlighting the negative consequences of not changing. Look for case studies that are similar. Highlight the stories of other organizations that have seen the pitfall and downfall of not changing. If the incentive to change is strong enough such that it helps the system and the individuals avoid a negative consequence, and in this case, negative consequences are going to be things like massive job loss, outsourcing of work, things that will threaten the employee community. And in a lot of ways, change can be seen as an opportunity, but also at the same time, there can be very negative consequences of not changing. In this type of culture, this is most likely the approach that a change leader will have to take in this type of an organization. To paraphrase, I thought this was a fantastic question, and it was really interesting to be able to break this down and talk a little bit about some of these really difficult places to implement change. So to go over our 5 elements again, remembering our stakeholders, the power and the influence. So looking for those union leaders and those who are very prominent in the organization, and in specifically the union organization, who are going to be able to provide you with the information that you're going to need to figure out how to make that change successful. So who are your leaders? And then who are some of your long service individuals? Who are those that are involved in the system and in the organization? Stories and history, understanding the history of the relationship between the organization and the union, and understanding the stories that are told about things that are happening. This is going to help to identify where the relationship is positive or strong and where the relationship is weak. And where are the areas that you as a change agent can come in and find that space, that opportunity to build a new story. Lastly, the culture. In this case, our change leader is struggling with a very negative and cynical culture. So when we're working with very negative cultures, we can't go in with unicorns and rainbows because everybody will laugh at us and everyone will think we're insincere and, just full of it. So, forget that approach and work with what you can. If you need to come in and talk about the consequences of not changing, this is the opportunity to do that. This is the type of organization where that message will actually work. And this is one of the only places where I would use a negative change message. Or, in some of the other literature, they call this the burning platform. What is the sort of big case for change? I don't think it needs to be that dramatic, but I do think that incentives for doing the change and what are the consequences of not changing, if we can outline that very clearly and use data, use case studies, use stories from other organizations to show that, then we can help the organization avoid those negative consequences. And that really becomes our role. When we are dealing with the union environment, we have to remember that the union itself is a system built to withstand change. And so we need to look at the system parameters as we are planning and figuring out how this change is going to work. Change without considering the system will fail. And so where you have a highly cynical organization at the same time with a highly entrenched, a very entrenched system, that's when you're going to have a really big challenge. So if I was stepping into an organization like this, I would be spending most of my time in the beginning understanding, figuring out who the most important individuals are, and working out and starting to forge ahead on that change story. Thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, I invite you to like, rate, share, and subscribe because it helps others find us. Our music is Levity by Emily Clausen. Change Course can be found wherever you get your podcasts, and we have an accessible version with fully edited captions on YouTube. You can find the link to this version on www.charthouse.ca in the Change Course podcast show notes. While you're visiting us, sign up for the Change Navigator newsletter. We're launching shortly, and you'll get a monthly dispatch of all things change and hear about the upcoming launch of ConnectedChange.com. Thank you for listening, and remember, it's never too late to change course.